Now then everybody, onto the fuel system. Now I had no real issue here when the bike was last on the road, so this should just be preventative maintenance to make sure I don't set myself on fire at the traffic lights. But while I'm here, I'm going to give them a thorough clean, so let's get them stripped. Stainless steel baking trays are really helpful here. They're great for catching any fluids or runaway screws that will inevitably drop. I'd already drained the float bowls before stripping the bike, so I removed the drain screws and set them aside. Flipping the carbs over, I started to remove the JIS screws that hold the float bowls on. I'm hoping these aren't too bad inside as they were stored dry. Perfect, well that's encouraging. The old gasket's pretty flattened and quite solid, and it actually broke up on removal, so due a new set for sure. To make access easier, I removed those small hoses from the coolant, or in this case, heating circuit. I also unscrewed and removed the idle speed adjuster, not forgetting the spring and washer on the end. With those bits removed, I worked through the remaining float bowls, all were in similar condition. The hinge pin for the floats are held in by this screw. With the screw and pin removed, the float just lifts out, bringing the float needle valve with it. The valve looked okay, but I'll replace these anyway for good measure. Unlike some carbs, the valve seats are removable by removing this retaining screw, which had corroded quite a bit, so I'll add these to the shopping list. The O-ring on this valve seat had been pinched slightly, which isn't ideal, but these will all be replaced along with the new float valves. I worked through the remaining floats, checking each one for any cracks or damage that might affect their function. But they all look good. Then I removed the remaining valve seats. Before I removed the mixer screw, I turned them in to record where they were already set. I've never needed to adjust these on this bike. I counted 2 3/4 turns out. That's quite a lot richer than standard for sure. I checked I had the needle, the spring and the washer, but the O-ring was still in the hole, so I fished that out gently with a pick. I removed the other 3, making sure all the parts were accounted for. Moving on to the main jet, I made sure I had a good fitting flathead screwdriver and removed the first one. The stock jets have different sizes on the outer and inner carbs to account for the additional heat in the middle, so I wanted to check if that was still the case with these. It was hard to read by eye, so I dug out my microscope for a closer look. So it's a Dynajet 1 through 6, which obviously isn't stock, but let's see if the middle ones are the same or different. Nope, same here. So these carbs have clearly seen some tuning in their 28 years of mixing fuel and air together. I'm keen to get a full picture of the tuning in order to plan the adjustments for the new pipe. With the main jets removed, I moved on to the pilot jets. All my research suggests that these should still be stock for most street tuning settings. And yeah, these are all the original jets. The only work I've ever done on these carbs is removing these to clear blockages when they've been stored for a while. But again, because I've stored it dry, these are all nice and clear. The general condition of the float chambers is good, so cleaning things shouldn't be too challenging. I flipped them over to make a start on the diaphragm side. With the 4 JIS screws removed, I carefully removed the cover with the spring, then gently pulled out the slide and needle. First impressions were good, so I removed the needle holder and needle from the back of the slide. Well, these aren't the stock needles. It looks like Dynajet to me, and they're in good condition. I checked the diaphragm rubbers for any wear or damage, as this will seriously affect performance. But splits can be hard to spot, so I like to shine a torch from behind to see if any light shines through, highlighting any cracks or splits. Having done some research, this definitely looks like the needle from a Dynojet Stage 1 kit, with the clip set to the third groove. This is all painting a picture of the existing fueling setup for me to plan from. Of course, the process of actually dialing these in will be a while down the road when it's all running again, but I'm hoping to make some educated predictions on the reassembly to get at least in the ballpark. Open to any suggestions from people that have run this sort of setup before. I worked through the remaining diaphragms, slides and needles, checking them all over and organising the parts. Then I removed the breather hoses from the T-piece between the carbs for better access. Compared to the float bowls, there was some dirt in here, but I do expect mainly that's from their time in storage where dust had settled on the slides. I made a start removing the airbox manifold. I checked it for any damage or wear, but it all looked good. I'll be replacing these O-rings too, which is just as well as this one seems to have been pinched outside the groove. This is the sort of thing that can cause a vacuum leak, which will really affect the carb balancing. Flipping things back over, I removed the emulsion tubes from the jet holders. I removed the screws that retain the choke mechanism. It looks like there should be 4, but interestingly, checking the manual, it's only actually 3. With the spring removed, I disengaged the plungers and removed the rail. I retrieved the plastic washers from the underside too, and now I had all the small parts ready for cleaning. I personally prefer to bag up the items with some diluted degreaser, as it keeps them organised and it also stops the main bath getting filthy as quickly. To split the carb bodies, I need to remove this rail, although some of the screws were seized in, so I had to be really careful to apply loads of downward pressure, a well-fitting JIS bit and a ratchet to remove some. They're secured on the other side with this long bolt and nut. And with that removed, they're ready to separate. Being careful not to lose the spring, I began pulling the carbs apart. The T-pieces for the float bowl breathers and fuel pipes just pull out, sealed on O-rings. Next, I retrieved the tension springs for the throttle linkage. Then I moved on to the other pair. With the carbs separated and fully accessible, I gave the bodies a good spray down with carb cleaner. This pre-clean removes the bulk of the dirt. Look at all that gunk that's already come off them. I pulled the air ducts out of the airbox manifold to check them over and to make cleaning a little easier. Then I peeled out the old foam gasket from the groove. So this is the first carb body ready to go in the ultrasonic tank for the sake of a before and after comparison. I gave it 10 minutes on one side and then 10 minutes on the other. After a quick rinse off, I blew it dry with the airline and I think it's come up pretty well. As the other three had their turn, I made a start stripping the link pipes for the carb heaters. Then I did the same with the breather pipes. For most of the plastic and rubber parts, I give them a spray with GT85 and then rub them dry with a clean towel. This tends to clean them quite well and also gives them a nice sheen. Now they had an initial clean, I can get on to something quite interesting. These here are the needle jets, which the slide needle runs in, metering the fueling between about 1/4 and 3/4 throttle. Which if you think about it, for most of us, that's where we spend most of our time on the throttle. Over the years, the hard needle wears the soft brass jet into a slight oval, which will allow more fuel to pass than it's supposed to, and it can make tuning a nightmare. Now these aren't technically a serviceable item, but NRP Carbs supply replacements that you can fit yourself with the right level of care and attention. At this point it seems like a no-brainer to replace them to give this bike the best chance of a long, healthy life. The kit from NRP came with good instructions, and as these can't be tapped out from the other side, they recommend tapping the old jet with an M3 thread in order to pull them out into the carb throat. Being careful not to tap too far through and damage the brass tube behind, I removed the tap and found a suitably long M3 cap head screw. With a couple of washers and a 10mm socket, I built a crude puller. I used some pliers to guide the screw into the needle jet and then span it in a few threads to secure it. To protect the aluminium of the side wall, I made a cushion of cardboard to go between the socket and the carb wall. Then I wound in the bolt until it started to get tight. And as my workshop's quite cold, I gave the whole area a blast with a heat gun to expand the carb body slightly and make the whole process a little easier. Doesn't take too long before it gives, and as soon as it lets go, it's quite easy going until it drops out into the socket. It goes without saying you need to make sure you clear out any swarf from the tapping once it's out. I unscrewed the jet from the bolt and looked it over. I mean, it's junk now, it's had a tap through the middle of it, but still cool. After I've removed all four, I took the new jets and I fitted the O-rings they came with into the grooves. Then I put them in the freezer for a few hours to help them going in. Same as before, I gave the carb bodies a blast with the heat gun to warm them up and then grabbed the jet. To drive them in safely, you need something that will sit on the shoulder of the jet and not the nozzle. The best thing I had lying around was this large crimp. I made sure it was the right way around and dropped it into the hole. What do you think of my bodge of a drift? I gave it some light taps and then rotated it round and kept tapping until it was in far enough. You can knock these in too far and damage the carb body, so it's important to take note of where the originals sit. If they're different across the carbs, obviously they'll meter fuel differently, which will make tuning a pain. Well, that's everything fully stripped and organised, and the carb bodies have had their initial clean. Now I can get on to the most important part of carb cleaning, the part that most videos on YouTube fail to appreciate, making sure all the passageways for all the different circuits are clear. Now I'm going to get into a bit of detail here, but it's important to understand the anatomy of carbs and understand which holes lead where to make sure you can fully clean them out. Let's do some theory. Now when the throttle butterfly is closed, the carb is running on the idle circuit. there's no real airflow through the carb throat, and the vacuum generated by the piston's intake stroke is applied to the idle discharge hole in the sidewall here. So the only open route with enough vacuum signal draws air in through the pilot air jet here and draws fuel up through the pilot jet from the float bowl. The fuel is metered by the idle mixture screw here, and it exits through the idle discharge port. Let's look at it on the carb. Air is drawn through the pilot air jet, down here, and whilst fuel is drawn through the pilot jet mixing with the air, that mixture then travels through these drillings where it's metered by the idle mixture screw that lives here, finally coming out the idle discharge hole here, and off into the intake port to make some bangs. So to test this is all clear, I'll squirt carb cleaner into the air jet, checking that it comes out of the pilot jet hole. Then I'll block the pilot jet hole and check it makes it all the way to the idle mixture hole. Then I'll block that too and check that it makes its way all the way to the discharge port. Great, that's all running clear. Now as you start to roll the throttle off idle, the butterfly begins to open. And as it does, it reveals these transition ports in the sidewall. This adds an instant enrichment to the increase of air that's entering the intake. From here until about quarter throttle, the pilot circuit is in full swing. I rotate the butterfly and squirt cleaner through the pilot jet tube, checking it comes out of all 5 holes. Great, they're all running clear too. And if anything doesn't, there's a good chance there's a blockage, and as this circuit has the smallest plumbing, it's the most likely to get clogged. Now in practice, the idle speed adjuster holds the butterfly slightly open, so in reality, at idle, it's a bit of a hybrid of these two circuits, with a very small amount of fuel leaving the transition ports. Before we move on, it's important to understand what makes this a constant velocity or CV carb, because it explains how the slide works and why all these passages need to be clear. On a CV carb, the throttle cable doesn't directly lift the slide. All it does is open the butterfly valve. The slide is lifted by vacuum. As the engine demands more air, air begins moving faster through the carb throat. And when we think about airflow here, there's an important distinction between how fast the air is moving and how much air is moving through the carb. There's a sweet spot on air speed where fuel atomizes into the airflow best. The goal of constant velocity carbs is to keep the airspeed constant and in that sweet spot, regardless of how much air is actually demanded by the engine. It does this by varying the cross-sectional area of the venturi. From a quarter throttle onwards, the faster moving air creates a pressure drop at a small vacuum port just downstream of the butterfly, and that vacuum is routed to the chamber behind the diaphragm. As vacuum increases, it lifts the slide. But the slide doesn't jump open instantly, it only rises as fast as the engine can actually use the air. As the slide lifts, the venturi area increases just enough to keep the airspeed through the carb in that sweet spot, where fuel atomizes best. There's also a small hole in the slide body itself. That controls how quickly the slide can respond to changes in vacuum. Air passing through that hole damps the slide's movement, preventing it from snapping open too fast. If the hole is larger, the slide reacts more quickly, and if it's smaller, the slide moves more slowly and smoothly. So if any of these vacuum passages, diaphragm areas, or slide bleed holes are blocked, the slide won't lift or respond correctly, even if all the jets themselves are perfectly clean. Looking at the carb, here's the vacuum port in the sidewall beneath the butterfly, which leads up here, through this orifice to the space behind the diaphragm. The increasing vacuum pulls the slide and in turn the needle further out of the needle jet here. This is the hole for the emulsion tube and main jet. And here is the main air jet. On my carbs, this has been plugged as per the dyno jet stage 1 instructions. So let's check it's all clear. I squirt cleaner through the vacuum port in the side wall and check it comes out of this hole in the diaphragm chamber. Finally, I squirt cleaner through the main jet hole and see it coming freely out the needle jet. And if your air jets aren't plugged like mine, you'll want to squirt from here too to check that they run clear. Finally, let's check the choke circuit, which is technically not a choke but a fuel enrichment circuit. When the choke lever is pulled, it retracts a plunger that opens up a passageway from the vacuum port into the float bowl, drawing fuel and air up and out the vacuum port and into the intake. This provides an enriched fueling compared to the idle circuit and helps with cold starts. Looking on the carb, here is the plunger, which opens up this passageway, drawing fuel through this jet here, and it draws air through this small bleed hole, which sits above the fuel level in the float bowl. The vacuum pulls that mixture out through the vacuum port and down into the intake. To check this is clear, I pull the plunger out to open the passageway and squirt cleaner into the fuel jet. I check it's coming out both the hole and the vacuum port. Of course, you can remove the plungers for a proper clean, which I will do, but I just wanted to demonstrate the function of this while it was in. Now I can give every passageway a blast of compressed air to remove any cleaning spray. Now I know that was a bit deep, but if any of those are blocked, it doesn't matter how shiny your car bodies are, the bike just won't run right. Now this video is swollen to be quite long, so I'm going to cut it in half and end this one here. I'll see you next week with a reassembly. I'll see you then.